I remember Halloween as a child. I anxiously prepared my costume a month in advance and enjoyed the fall weather and spooky movies. I strategically planned the night before with friends of which streets we would go to and see if we could score the big candy bars. The big day would come and we would head out on the street at dusk with our pillowcases in hand and our parents a safe distance away. We ran joyfully from house to house collecting candy and getting spooked along the way. When our pillowcases were heavy and the porch lights went out, we walked home to count how many Reese's peanut butter cups we had collected. I would go home and dump my pillowcase of sugar on the dining room table and separate all my candy by brand as my parents watched to make sure the wrappers were all intact and there wasn't anything strange mixed in all the candy. This was also the opportunity for them to see which candy I wouldn't eat and call dibs on it. Yes, Dad, you can have all the Three Musketeers bars. Though checking my candy was a fun experience for me, I learned the importance of it. My parents grew up during a time when finding razor blades in apples and poisoned candy was becoming headline news. Yes, most of these reports were sick hoaxes, but there were a few that were very real. And on Halloween in 1974, Timothy O'Brien was one of these victims, not because of a stranger poisoning his candy, but his own father. Ronald O'Brien, his wife Deneen, I think that's how you pronounce it, and their 2 children lived in Deer Park, Texas. Ronald was always seen as a family man and good father. He worked as an optician at the Texas State Optical Company, and he was a deacon in the local Baptist church. From all reports, the family was respectable. But secretly, Ronald had his fair share of issues. In a 10-year span, he managed to go through 21 different jobs. He got fired from these jobs due to negligence and theft. In 1974, Ronald was 30 years old, and he was about to be fired again because he stole money from his employer. He was in hot water. He barely made enough money to cover food and rent. He was over $100,000 in debt and wasn't making payments on his car, so that was about to be repoed, and he and his wife had to sell their home. On Halloween night in 1974, the O'Brien family was invited to Jim Bates' home. Jim Bates was a family friend. They were invited over for dinner in Pasadena, Texas. The plan was for Ronald and Jim to take the 4 kids trick-or-treating in Jim's neighborhood after dinner. The children walked around the neighborhood going house to house collecting candy. They eventually went to the neighbor's house, the Melvin family, and knocked on the door, but they didn't get a response and turned around to leave. Ronald had stayed behind the kids the whole time. He ran up behind the kids waving big pixie sticks in the air as the kids walked away from the house. He said that the rich neighbors were handing out expensive candy. Side note, I always tried to eat the pixie sticks I got for Halloween before my parents threw them away because it's essentially flavored powdered sugar. Anyway, Ronald held onto the candy and the group continued trick-or-treating. It started to rain, so the group went back to Jim's house. When the group returned to Jim's house after their outing, Ronald gave each of the kids a pixie stick and gave the last trick-or-treater that knocked on the door the last pixie stick. A total of 5 pixie sticks were given out. Eventually, Ronald, Timothy, and Elizabeth went back home. That night, Ronald told his kids they could each have 1 piece of candy before going to bed. I also remember doing this as a kid, but it was usually several pieces of candy, not just 1. Anyway, Timothy decided to eat the pixie stick, which he said tasted bitter. In a matter of seconds after drinking some Kool-Aid that Ronald gave him, Timothy started to cry that his stomach hurt. He then began convulsing, vomiting, and gasping for air in the bathroom. An ambulance was called, but sadly Timothy died en route to the hospital. He was only 8 years old. Timothy's body was taken for an autopsy at the hospital, and the medical examiner thought it was odd that he could smell almonds coming from Timothy's breath. For those unaware, cyanide smells like almonds. This is something I learned a long time ago back in the fire academy. If you smell almonds where you shouldn't smell them, leave. Anyway, the autopsy confirmed that Timothy had suffered from cyanide poisoning. He had so much in his system that it could have killed 3 grown men. The police were able to get a hold of the other 4 pixie sticks and found that the tops of the pixie sticks had been replaced with cyanide granules instead of sugar and stapled clothes. I'm not sure how the police retrieved the pixie stick from the random trick-or-treater that took the last one, but it was reported that the 11-year-old boy who had it was found asleep in his bed with the pixie stick in his arms. He had tried to open it but was unable to pull it apart because of the staple in the tube. Investigators and police had a lot of questions for Ronald and Jim after the death of Timothy. Where did they get the pixie sticks? But Ronald couldn't get his story straight. The police took Ronald and Jim back to the neighborhood the group had been trick-or-treating in so they could direct them to the house where Ronald had picked up the pixie sticks. But he was stumped. He couldn't find the house and said he'd never seen the face of the person responsible. He said that the person just emerged from the doorway and handed him the candy. A few days later, he claimed that he got the candy from Mr. Melvin, the neighbor. But when the kids went to the Melvin house that night, no one answered the door and the lights were out. Police went to Mr. Melvin's place of work and arrested him, but he had an alibi. Mr. Melvin had been at work that night and didn't return until late that evening, which he was able to prove. This is when investigators started to hone in on Ronald. Investigators discovered that Ronald was in debt, and interestingly, he increased the life insurance coverage on both of his children in 1974. By mid-October, there was $30,000 worth of coverage for each child. Meanwhile, the coverage for himself and his wife were worth pennies in comparison. Investigators also found adding machine tape that was used in old calculators before they became digital. And on the tape, they found that Ronald had written down the amount of money owed on each of his bills. The total amounted to the exact amount of money he would collect from the insurance proceeds. That's not suspicious or anything. So at this point, police considered Ronald a person of interest, and they proceeded to dig deeper. They discovered that Ronald tried to get cyanide from various chemical companies. In August 1974, he tried to get cyanide from his employer, the Texas State Optical Company, but wasn't successful. In September 1974, he called the Arco Chemical Company, where one of his friends worked, and he spoke to his friend about the different types of cyanide and how he could obtain cyanide. Then again, before Halloween, he called the Curtin Matheson Scientific Company, which is a chemical outlet in Houston, Texas. Ronald was told they only sell large amounts of cyanide for purchase. So, Ronald eventually went to Houston to talk to the salesperson who worked for the company and asked if he could purchase a smaller amount. A search warrant was conducted on Ronald's home, and police found a pocket knife in Ronald's home that had candy residue on it. The police speculated that Ronald must have used the pocket knife to cut open the pixie stick so he can contaminate the sugar. Of course, the whole time the investigation was going on, Ronald acted like the grieving father and said he was innocent. However, when he took a polygraph test, he failed it. And yes, polygraphs aren't the most reliable, but combine that with the evidence that police collected, it resulted in Ronald being arrested on November 5th, 1974, and charged with Timothy's murder. According to Harris County prosecutor Mike Hinton, who was investigating this case, Ronald loved all the attention he was getting. Ronald entered a not guilty plea, and the case went to court. The defense argued that the tainted candy came from an unknown boogeyman who got a thrill out of poisoning children. But Ronald's family and friends had already turned on him and testified against him in court. The press gave him the name the Candyman. On June 3, 1975, after less than an hour of deliberations, the Harris County jury found Ronald O'Brien guilty of murder and sentenced him to death by electric chair. Ronald appealed his conviction several times over the years, and all of his appeals were denied. On March 31, 1984, Ronald was put to death at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville, Texas. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the use of the electric chair was cruel and unusual punishment. Therefore, Ronald's life was ended by lethal injection. His last words were, "What is about to transpire in a few moments is wrong. I would forgive all who have taken part in any way in my death." There are many theories as to why Ronald picked Halloween night to poison the candy. According to Dr. Joni Johnson, who is a forensic psychologist, poisoners, or people who poison other people, usually lack empathy and are cold and strategic. According to her, poisoners are sneaky, but not someone who is physically or emotionally abusive. I couldn't find any indication that Ronald was an abusive father or husband, but anyway. Did Ronald use poison so he could try to blame it on someone else because there was fear in the media at the time that kids were getting poisoned via Halloween candy? I don't know. What I don't understand is that if he wanted insurance money from his kids, then why did he give the candy to the other kids that were unrelated to him? Especially the trick-or-treater who showed up at the door and was given a pixie stick. This makes no sense to me. Why didn't he just put the cyanide in the kid's pixie sticks and leave the other pixie sticks alone? This behavior really makes no sense and really makes me wonder. So what do you think about this case? Do you have any theories? Leave a comment down below and let me know. As always, thanks for watching. If you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing. If you have any suggestions, cases, or stories you would like me to cover, please feel free to leave a comment down below. And as always, stay safe.